Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who were kind enough to listen to my sermon last week, I feel obligated to say two words that I don't often say. Go green. Now that I'm not saying go blue anymore, I can say that. All kidding aside, though, it's been a difficult week. Of course, we've been watching the news with San Bernardino and everything that has transpired over the last couple days, and as information continues to come out. Of course, we know what the initial response was, and now where we're at, it looking like an act of terrorism. But if we're really honest with ourselves in our hearts, we know on some level we have to talk about guns and the role that guns play in American society. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we have to ask the question, we have a right to guns, but how do we keep the hands out of the guns of the bad guys? And how do we do that when the people who are buying the guns are not yet bad? If we're really honest with ourselves, we as a society have to wrestle with that question. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we look at not just San Bernardino, but all of the mass shootings that have taken place in the last year. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we have to say that of course what happened in San Bernardino was terrorism. But not just what happened in San Bernardino. When a gunman, no matter what his religion is, goes into a Planned Parenthood clinic and shoots it up, I'm sorry, that's an act of terrorism. When somebody goes into a high school trying to inflict fear and pain and suffering on innocent kids, that's an act of terrorism. And it's been taking place virtually every day in our society. So much so that when we come to hearing about San Bernardino, it's almost as if we shrug our shoulders and say, look what happened again. And we're starting to become numb to these mass shootings. We're starting to become numb to the terrorism. We're starting to become numb to the fact that it's not just people killing people. It's people using guns to kill people. And as we become numb to these realities, and if we're really honest with ourselves, we start to realize we're living in fear. I'm living in fear. We look at a stranger, and we wonder whether or not he or she will be the next terrorist, whether or not he or she will be the next mentally ill person to take out a gun and shoot up a perfectly innocent place of business. God forbid, a house of worship. If we're really honest with ourselves, we're looking at the other, and we're judging them by the color of their skin, by where they're coming from. We're judging them by their religion. And when we do that, if we're really honest with ourselves, and today's a day, Shabbos is a day for honesty, we realize that the terrorists are starting to win. We realize that when we live in fear, when we live with prejudice, the terrorists are starting to win. And it was with this in mind that I began looking at our Torah portion for this week, Parashat Vayeshev. And at two significant points in our Torah portion, we learn about the other. We learn about the stranger in our midst. The very first happens at the beginning of our Torah portion, and we know Joseph and his brothers don't get along. Jacob, their father, well favors Joseph. After all, he gave him that katonet pasim, that amazing Technicolor dream coat. We know that Joseph is the beloved son of the 12. And we know that Joseph knows that he's a beloved son of the 12 because he loves to tell tales about his brothers. And so his brothers hate him. His brothers are jealous of him. And sure enough, the brothers are all off one day as they told their father, tending sheep. When Jacob, their father, asked, where are they? They've been gone far too long. The Torah tells us the brothers told their father they were going off to tend sheep in Shechem, which is roughly a 5 days walk from where Jacob and his sons were living. Sure enough, they're gone more than 5 days. They're gone 6 days, 7 days, whatever it happens to be. They're gone long enough that Jacob starts to wonder where his sons have gone. So Joseph, who's at home living the good life, he's sent by their father Jacob to go find out where these brothers are. And Joseph arrives in Shechem, and he looks around. And all he sees for miles and miles are open fields with nothing around. No people, no civilization, no sheep, and no shepherds. Our Torah tells us he sees nothing for miles and miles. When all of a sudden it says in our Torah portion, Vayimsa Ehu Ish, in Ish, a man comes upon him and tells Joseph exactly where the brothers are. They're not in Shechem. This Ish, this man tells them, they're in Dotan. They're in this city about 15 miles away. Maybe they're at the casino, they're out to dinner, whatever it happens to be. And this man, this Ish, tells Joseph where he can find the brothers. Joseph had looked around for miles and miles and miles and saw nobody, but then all of a sudden up pops this Ish, our Torah tells us. And so the rabbis wrestle with the question, who is this man that popped up out of nowhere? Ibn Ezra, always a very practical reader, says he's just a guy who popped up. Joseph didn't notice him, and he pops up out of nowhere. Happens all the time. But the Rambam and the Ramban and Rashi all agree that this Ish that Joseph encountered, this strange man who popped up out of nowhere, was the angel Gabriel, sent down by God with a very specific mission to make sure that Joseph didn't wind up in trouble then, but that Joseph reunited with his brothers so that his brothers could then sell him into slavery in Egypt, and ultimately our ancestors would make their way down to Egypt, where they needed to be enslaved for 400 years, so that God could bring them out with an outstretched arm and bring us to freedom into the promised land. Our rabbis tell us that this was not some random stranger that Joseph encountered, but an angel of God, sent by God himself. Now that's one aspect of the stranger in our Torah portion this morning. The other one comes really, if you look at the Torah portion as a whole, if you look globally at our Torah portion, and Joseph is a man of dreams. In the very beginning of our portion, we see that Joseph has these dreams where his 11 brothers are bowing down to him. But it's not happening. It's not till the end of our Torah portion and into next week's Torah portion where we see that Joseph's dreams don't actually come true until he checks his ego at the door and he starts interpreting the dreams of others. Joseph's dreams don't come true until he helps the dreams of others come true. We know that Joseph came into contact in prison with Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's baker. And it was there in prison that they were having all these dreams. And Joseph comes forward and says, look, with God's help, Joseph tells them, I can interpret these dreams. And sure enough, Joseph, with God's help, steps in and interprets the dreams of these perfect strangers, one of whom eventually comes out of prison, remembers Joseph, tells Pharaoh about Joseph. Pharaoh brings Joseph out of prison, elevates him to second in command of all of Egypt after Joseph begins interpreting dreams for Pharaoh. Joseph finally realizes his dream of becoming powerful, realizes his dream of having the brothers bow down to him, when he starts helping the dreams of others come true. When he helps the dreams of these perfect strangers come to life. Our Torah portion tells us that the strangers we sing among us might very well be angels sent by God to help us. And our Torah portion this week, Parashat Vayeshev, comes to teach us that our own dreams won't come true until we embrace the dreams of others and help them come to life. This week of Parashat Vayeshev, we have to realize our own reactions to strangers. We have to start to realize our fear that's taking over our lives. And that our tradition, Jewish tradition, comes to teach very clearly that we cannot fear the stranger. But in fact, we have to recognize the presence of God in that person. Now, we live in the real world, and Judaism teaches us to live in the real world. We know that that stranger might be a terrorist. We know that the other might be out to hurt us or to kill us. And we can't put those fears away entirely, because that too would be a violation of Jewish law, which says that we have an obligation to protect ourselves. At the same time, as we read in the Talmud, we treat all others as we treat ourselves, mipnei darchei shalom, for the sake of peace, because that's how we accomplish peace. And remind ourselves that in the Torah, it teaches each of us to love the stranger because we were strangers once. I don't have any easy answers for how we go forward today, trying to balance our real fears that that other might indeed be somebody out to hurt us or our way of life. But I do know that Jewish tradition is very clear that we must love our neighbors as ourselves, that we must reach out to all who are in need, not just Jews. We must reach out to all who are in need, mipnei darchei shalom, for the sake of peace. This is our challenge as a society. This is our blessing as a Jewish people. I look forward to partnering with each of you as we wrestle with this very important question. How do we realize our fears? How do we seek to honor and to love the stranger? And how can we be, not just on Shabbos, but each and every day, honest with ourselves and as a society about the reality of gun violence and the presence of terrorism from Islamic extremists and from a whole host of other extremists in our country as well. Adonai ozi amo yitain, Adonai yivarechet amo shalom. May God truly grant us the strength to protect ourselves and perhaps most importantly to protect our way of life. May God bless us all with peace. And let us say together, Amen.